that time we were looking at an invitation to join the ranks of the Warner Brothers group. One word: lazy.
There are guitar legends who smile through every interview, shake every hand, and say all the right things. Billy Gibbons is not that man. At 75 years old, the ZZ Top frontman has earned the right to say exactly what he thinks, and for the first time in decades, the man behind the beard, the shades, and one of the most recognizable tones in rock history has let the curtain drop. What came out wasn't pretty. It wasn't diplomatic, but it was pure Billy Gibbons, honest, sharp, and dripping with the same Texas swagger that built his legend over 50 years ago. Gibbons didn't build ZZ Top by playing it safe. He built it by refusing to compromise, by keeping the blues raw when everyone else was polishing it smooth, and by treating authenticity as the only currency that mattered. So when he talks about the artists who got under his skin, you better believe there's a reason. These aren't grudges born from petty jealousy. They're the frustrations of a man who watched the music he loved get diluted, borrowed, commercialized, and repackaged by people who never paid the dues he paid. From counterfeit cowboys to borrowed flames, here are the 5 artists Billy Gibbons couldn't stand, and why it says everything about who he really is. Billy Gibbons was raised on a very simple philosophy. The blues is not a costume. You cannot buy it, borrow it, or package it for prime time. It lives in the cracks of broken amplifiers, in the second verse of a song written at 2 in the morning with nowhere else to go. That's why the explosion of Garth Brooks onto the American music scene in the early 1990s hit Gibbons like a bad note in a quiet room. Brooks was undeniably talented. Nobody serious disputes that. He could command an arena, move a crowd, and sell records by the truckload. But to Gibbons, what Brooks was selling wasn't country music in its honest form, and it certainly wasn't the blues. It was a carefully manufactured product designed to feel emotional without actually being vulnerable. The production was immaculate, the performances were choreographed, and the emotions were telegraphed from a mile away. For a man like Gibbons, who had spent his entire career chasing the exact opposite, that kind of slickness felt like a betrayal of everything Southern music stood for. What made it worse was the way Nashville began folding blues phrasing and Texas imagery into pop country albums. During that era, Gibbons watched his musical traditions he had dedicated his life to protecting got absorbed into a machine built for radio playlists and suburban consumption. He reportedly kept his public comments vague but cutting, once describing the Nashville sound of that era as music designed for people who wanted to feel country without getting any dirt on them. His inner circle knew exactly who he was talking about. The irony that Brooks himself cited ZZ Top as an early influence was not lost on Gibbons. To have your own work held up as the inspiration for something you consider artistically hollow is a particular kind of frustration. Gibbons' rejection of Brooks wasn't personal hatred. It was the defense of a standard, the insistence that there's a difference between music that comes from lived experience and music that merely references it. This one is complicated, and Billy Gibbons would probably be the first to admit it, because the truth about his feelings towards Stevie Ray Vaughan was never simple. It was never hatred. What it was, at its most honest, was the deep and uncomfortable pride of a mentor watching his student outrun him in public, and never quite knowing how to make peace with that. Gibbons was already a Texas blues institution by the time a young Stevie Ray Vaughan started showing up at his gigs in Austin. The kid was electric, hungry, and paying attention to everything. You could see Gibbons' influence all over Vaughan's early playing, the heavy string gauge, the dense overdriven tone, the Texas shuffle rhythms that felt like they came straight out of the ZZ Top catalog. At first, Gibbons took it as a compliment, but as Vaughan's career caught fire in the early 1980s and the music press started crowning him the new king of Texas blues, something shifted. The problem wasn't Stevie's talent. Gibbons, by all accounts, genuinely respected it. The problem was the narrative. Every magazine cover that declared Vaughan the savior of the blues was, at least implicitly, saying that the genre had been waiting to be saved. Gibbons had been flying that flag for 2 decades. He had built ZZ Top into a global force without ever abandoning the roots that fed them. And now a younger guitarist was being credited with a revival that, from where Gibbons stood, had never actually died. Their personal interactions were brief and loaded. Gibbons never openly attacked Vaughan, never said anything that could be directly quoted as dismissive. But people who were close to both men described a palpable tension whenever their paths crossed. When Vaughan passed away in 1990, Gibbons released a statement calling him a brother in tone. Those who knew him best said he carried the weight of everything left unresolved for years afterward. The admiration was real. So was the wound. If the Vaughan situation was complicated, the Billy Gibbons and Ronnie Van Zant dynamic was something closer to a straightforward clash of kingdoms. Two Southern rock giants, both deeply proud, both absolutely convinced their version of the South was the authentic one, thrown together on tour stages in the mid-1970s and discovering very quickly that the brotherhood of guitars does not automatically mean brotherly love. ZZ Top and Lynyrd Skynyrd looked, from the outside, like natural allies. They were both carrying the Southern rock banner at a time when it needed carrying. Both bands were built on loud guitars, regional pride, and the kind of working-class swagger that resonated with audiences across the American heartland. But the similarities stopped at the surface. Gibbons ran a precise operation. He cared about sound quality, stage setup, timing, and control. Van Zant ran on instinct and fire, and he wore his chaos like a badge of honor. Their disagreements during the stretch of dates they shared in the mid-1970s became the stuff of backstage legend. The competition was constant, from soundcheck conflicts to on-stage theatrics designed to upstage whoever went on before them. Van Zant was provocative by nature, and Gibbons, despite his cool exterior, was not without ego. They pushed each other in ways that were sometimes creative and sometimes just ugly. When Gibbons eventually withdrew from a shared stretch of dates after one incident too many, he did it without public explanation. He just walked. Van Zant died in the 1977 Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash, which closed the chapter before either man could fully process what it had been. Gibbons never eulogized him with fanfare, but people who knew him said he held complicated respect for Van Zant even through the friction. Two lions who refused to share a stage without a fight, and both of them knowing it. By the time Kid Rock arrived with his bombastic, genre-blending swagger in the late 1990s, Billy Gibbons had already weathered disco, glam metal, grunge, and the full commercial takeover of country music. Nothing had rattled him, but Kid Rock managed to find a specific nerve that ran deeper than musical disagreement. What bothered Gibbons about Kid Rock wasn't just the sound, it was the branding. Kid Rock had built an entire identity around Southern rebellion, blues authenticity, and working-class grit. He wore it loudly, waved the flag, dropped the references, and called himself an outlaw. The problem, from Gibbons' perspective, was that the whole thing felt like a performance of a culture rather than an expression of one. Kid Rock had grown up in Michigan. His blues references were assembled from other people's records. His Southern imagery was aesthetic, not biographical. And to a man who had spent his entire life earning every note he played in the actual South, that kind of performance felt like costume wearing. The public admiration Kid Rock showed for ZZ Top made things worse rather than better. Gibbons reportedly found it harder to dismiss a man who openly credited him as an influence, because it meant engaging with the frustrating reality that influence doesn't always produce understanding. Kid Rock could name every great ZZ Top track and still miss the entire point of why those tracks mattered. The music wasn't about being cool. It was about being honest. And to Gibbons, Kid Rock had mistaken the packaging for the product. When Born Free was released in 2010, with its layers of Southern imagery and borrowed blues textures, people close to Gibbons said he was done extending any benefit of the doubt. He reportedly told a close friend that selling a blues aesthetic without the actual experience behind it was like selling barbecue smoke without the fire. He turned down every collaboration offer that came his way, and his one-liners in response became the stuff of legend among those who collected Gibbons' quotes. The blues don't need a remix. The blues don't need Wi-Fi. The blues don't need a cosign from someone who found them on a streaming playlist. Here is where things get genuinely interesting, because the tension between Billy Gibbons and Eric Clapton was never simple animosity. It was something richer and more philosophically loaded than that. These were two men who loved the same music, traced their roots to the same Delta masters, and spent their entire careers in service of the blues. But they arrived at that service from completely different directions, and neither one ever fully accepted the other's path as valid. Clapton approached the blues as a scholar approaches a sacred text. He was precise, reverent, and deeply concerned with preservation. His technique was immaculate, his phrasing careful, and his respect for the tradition almost academic in its intensity. For millions of fans worldwide, that approach made him the definitive voice of blues-influenced rock guitar. But for Gibbons, it was exactly the wrong way to treat music that was built on improvisation, urgency, and the refusal to be contained. Gibbons had always believed that the blues needed to breathe, bend, and occasionally break its own rules to stay alive. He pushed his tone to extremes, embraced distortion as an emotional tool, and treated the tradition as a launching pad rather than a museum piece. From his perspective, Clapton's careful handling of the blues, however technically masterful, drained it of the very quality that made it essential. The blues weren't meant to be performed correctly. They were meant to be felt completely. Their interactions over the years carried the quiet weight of two men who respected each other's body of work while fundamentally disagreeing about its meaning. A 1979 London jam session reportedly ended abruptly after Gibbons unleashed a characteristically loud and unruly Texas-flavored set that Clapton found excessive. Clapton's comments about too much distortion and not enough feeling got back to Gibbons quickly. Gibbons' response, in the way he talked about blues authenticity in subsequent interviews without ever using Clapton's name, was just as pointed. When Clapton launched his celebrated Blues Nights residency at the Royal Albert Hall in the early 1990s, Gibbons declined his invitation. He kept his reasons professional in public, but privately made clear that putting the blues in a concert hall and dressing it in formal presentation struck him as a fundamental misunderstanding of what the music was for. The blues came from the floor, not from stalls and dress circles. The irony is that both men were right about different things. Clapton's preservation instinct produced some of the most technically beautiful blues guitar work in rock history. Gibbons' evolutionary approach kept the tradition dangerous and alive in a way that pure preservation never could. But neither man was particularly interested in giving the other full credit, and in that stubbornness, they each revealed something true about themselves. Billy Gibbons at 75 is not a man softened by time. He still plays with the same urgency that drove him out of Houston roadhouses in the late 1960s. He still treats every note as a statement and every silence as a choice. The 5 names on this list are not enemies in the conventional sense. They are the pressure points in a life spent defending something he believed was worth defending, whether it was the polished artificiality of commercial country, the complicated pride of watching a protege overtake you, the stubborn clash of two southern giants, the performance of authenticity without its substance, or the philosophical divide between preservation and evolution. Each of these rivalries tells you something real about who Billy Gibbons is. He is a man who cared too much to stay quiet and too long to forget. That combination makes for complicated relationships and extraordinary music. And at 75, with the beard still magnificent and the guitar still raw, he wouldn't have it any other way.